Yamamoto vs. Yhwach is easily one of the greatest fights in the entirety of BLEACH, and combined with the S-tier adaptation the anime gave it, it's easy to see why. But what if I told you that there's much more to this fight than you think? What if I told you that in this fight are some masterfully placed details that not only foreshadow events that take place within it, but even future ones? Details that not only involve events in the distant past, but also events we saw take place just a few hundreds of chapters ago. All of which came together in a plot twist that was right in front of us the entire time. And I mean that plot twist. So if all three of you do make it to the end of this video, I think you might leave with a little more appreciation for this fight. So I'd highly appreciate if, you do the YouTube stuff, you leave a like and subscribe, and yes, I will continue to pretend I haven't been away for over a year now. So with that said, let's get right into it. So it all began with what I can only call the absolute worst day in Yamamoto's entire existence, beginning with the death of his most loyal student and also war crime compadre Tojiro Sasakibe at the hands of an unknown enemy. Yeah, we'll come back to that unknown enemy. And it only got worse from there, because after that he would then watch as everything he had built for the past 2,000 years would fall apart as the Gote 13, the closest thing to a family he had at the time, would also have a great number of their squads brutally murdered, with almost half the captains of said squads having their bankai, which, are the very thing that define their positions as captains, stolen from them and used to humiliate and also defeat them. And as if things couldn't get any worse, it turns out the unknown enemy wasn't that unknown after all. It was actually just a love child of, the angry German and Jesus Christ. And his holokai... Am I allowed to say that word? I don't think I'm allowed to say that on YouTube, am I? And I don't think I want to find out whether I am, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. But yes, an enemy Yamamoto believed he had exterminated 1,000 years ago, which would mean that Yamamoto wasn't just angry at Yhwach and the Quincy, but also kind of at himself. Because as Mayuri points out, you could kind of blame Yamamoto for failing to kill Yhwach 1,000 years ago. And unfortunately, this anger at both his enemy and himself would do a much better job at clouding his judgments than Kyoka Suigetsu ever could. That Kyoka Suigetsu reference is going to be extremely relevant very soon. Now let's talk about the actual fight. Right from the start of the fight, there's a very strong indication of intention on Kubo's part here. I say this mainly due to the placement of two key details in the introductory section of the fight that really set the tone for what this fight is about to become. The first being a major parallel established between Yhwach and Yamamoto, where we see that immediately upon arriving on the battlefield, Yamamoto's first priority is to save Kenpachi from Yhwach, who was about to kill him, indicating that he's a much more compassionate leader than Yhwach, who when placed in a similar situation, i.e. when Yamamoto is believed to have killed Ace, Mask, and Bas B, had nothing to say except LOL skill issue. And as if to further drive home the point, Yamamoto explicitly points out how little of a crap Yhwach gives about his men, and how this is framed tells us that this is a fact Yamamoto has always known about Yhwach, not just an observation he just made. And once again, this fact will be relevant later in the video. Yeah, this is one of those fights where every major detail is built upon as it progresses, because Kubo was really in his bag with this one. And by the way, Yamamoto's whole compassionate leader act doesn't really last long. It doesn't age well. The second detail can be found in what happens immediately afterwards. Right after Yamamoto finishes grandstanding about being employer of the millennium, he attacks Yhwach. It wasn't a special attack by any definition, it was just a basic slash enhanced by Ryujin Jaka's flames, which while Yhwach successfully blocks with his bare arm, it does cause him to bleed quite a bit. I found this extremely weird, especially considering the fact that the flames of Ryujin Jaka, while still immensely powerful and implied to even scale above almost all the captains in Can't Fear Your Own World, these are still the same flames that Basby was able to counter with his own and save the lives of S, Mask, and himself. So for Yhwach, who should be inconceivably more powerful than Basby, to bleed from an attack of that same degree kind of implies that the power gap between the two might not be as large as we imagined, which would imply that Yhwach wasn't on his A game, or maybe it wasn't even Yhwach to begin with. And as we continue, you'd notice that there's even more signs pointing to the latter conclusion. And it does make you wonder if Yamamoto ever needed to use his bankai in the first place, because think about it, he did draw blood with just basic shikai attacks. If he whipped out something like Enetsu Jigoku, the fight would be over. And it gets even crazier when you consider the fact that despite being able to draw blood in shikai, Yamamoto was still holding back and was waiting for Yhwach to draw his own sword before taking the fight seriously. This alone should have been proof of the massive power gap that existed between these two characters. But despite this clear fact, Yamamoto would still go ahead to use his bankai, even though he knew full well just how dangerous it would be to use his bankai in the Soul Society. I mean, you could argue that Yamamoto activated his bankai because he felt he needed that level of power to defeat someone like Yhwach, which wouldn't be wrong considering that was the power he used to defeat Yhwach 1,000 years ago. But in my opinion, I feel like the right question to ask isn't if Yamamoto knew that Yhwach seemed weaker than usual, but rather if he cared at all. Because after all the pain and suffering Yhwach and the Quincy had inflicted on Soul Society, I don't think Yamamoto was just looking to kill him in the easiest way possible. What he wanted to do was to take all that pain, suffering, and torture that had been inflicted on Soul Society and multiply it infinitely back onto Yhwach, basically making him feel everything that he had put Soul Society through. Think of Ulquiorra using Segunda Itapa even though Murcielago had more than enough power to kill Ichigo. So he didn't just want to kill Yhwach, he wanted to make him suffer. So the fight quickly turns into a one-sided mauling where Zanka No Tachi's extremely broken abilities prove to be far too much for Yhwach to handle, who at this point is unarmed, overpowered, and completely outclassed. And with his sword broken and his arrows rendered useless, Yhwach resorts to using a Quincy spell called Sankt Zwinger. This is a technique that he explains would strike down Yamamoto with the light of God if he came within range. At face value, this line sounds pretty okay, it's a rather innocuous description of his technique, but in hindsight, it becomes extremely weird, because this is the one single instance in the entirety of Yhwach's existence where he mentions God. And yes, I know he calls the Soul King a false god, but I mean in the same context, in the context of reverence that God was someone who could protect him from Yamamoto's flames. But while this sounds weird coming from Yhwach, you know who else likes to reference God a whole lot? It's the sternritter. Because most of the sternritter, if not all of them, not only refer to themselves as servants of God, but also have multiple attacks, abilities, and even their Volstern-dish transformations named after aspects of God, like God's justice, God's judgment, God's steps, and God's poison taster, please don't ask me what that means, and the fear of God, along with many others. And the story implies quite heavily that the God they speak of is none other than Yhwach himself. So, which God was Yhwach talking about here? Was it himself? Was it the Soul King who he has absolutely zero respect for? Or was this just another hint that the person we were seeing wasn't actually Yhwach to begin with? And if this isn't evident enough, I think the next part of the fight will only make it more apparent. In response to Sankt Zwinger, Yamamoto would then activate the South variant of his bankai, Kakajuma no Sojin. And it's a pretty basic technique, it just, reanimates the corpse of every single person he's killed in his 1,000-year existence, and yeah, there's a trillion of them. No, but jokes aside, the activation of Kakajuma no Sojin really marks a turning point in this fight, because it is at this exact point that the entire established dynamic of the fight so far would completely switch, with Yamamoto, who was originally introduced as employer of the millennium, now brandishing a world-ending power that he honestly really didn't need to use, and seemingly without a single care in the world, really took his time to torture Yhwach, all while his bankai was deep-frying the planet. And Yhwach, who was earlier depicted as a guy who would fail literally any worker rights evaluation test in existence, shows an uncharacteristically emotional side. He's visibly disturbed by the fact that he's seeing the corpses of his men puppeteered by his enemy. He's saddened by that fact, and it's painfully clear. It's a bit funny seeing people bring up this scene as an example of why this fight is poorly written as they would claim, completely missing the fact that this scene is exactly meant to be as bizarre as most people note it to be. Yamamoto at the start of the fight notes that Yhwach doesn't care about his men, so why would he even think that Yhwach would be shaken by the sight of his fallen men brought back to face him? And if Yhwach doesn't care about his men as noted by Yamamoto, why would he care now? The first thing to note would probably be Yamamoto's state of mind at this point in the fight. Yamamoto was so consumed by his rage that it almost appears as though he had forgotten who he was fighting. But was it really just his anger that was blinding him, or was it something much deeper? And I think the picture is made much clearer near the end of the fight. When Yamamoto's about to finish off Yhwach with Tenchi Kaijin, he makes a very interesting statement. He tells him that all the pain and suffering he had caused Yhwach and the Quincy's were really nothing in comparison to what he had inflicted on the Soul Reapers and Soul Society. It would seem that from this statement, Yamamoto believed himself to be some emissary of justice who was executing judgments upon the evil Quincy who had wronged him in Soul Society. But was it anywhere near that simple? Because if you've read the manga or Can't Feel Your Own World, you know that Soul Society is definitely nowhere near as innocent in this war as they'd like us to think. And among the Soul Reapers, I doubt there's anyone near as reprehensible as Yamamoto. I mean, the guy has 1 trillion bodies to his name, and if you check Soken's book, the one that Uryu was reading in episode 6, there's an illustration of Yamamoto that depicts him as some sort of boogeyman who killed an innumerable number of Quincy during the war. But then what did Yamamoto feel about all the pain and suffering that he had caused the Quincy? Yamamoto never considers the fact that all the horrible things that had just taken place were a direct result of his own actions that he took 1,000 years ago. But to him, the Quincy were simply just evil. In his eyes, they were corpses from a bygone era that he needed to incinerate. And in the same way Yamamoto's self-righteousness prevented him from seeing the nuance of the current war with the Quincy's, was the same way that it prevented him from seeing the difference between the literal caricature of Yhwach he had created in this revenge fantasy he was living out and the real Yhwach that he actually knew. The real Yhwach being the one that he spoke about at the start of the fight. And as he prepares to deliver the finishing blow, the anime makes a really cool addition. As he's about to swing his blade, you see multiple flashes between the past and present Yamamoto. All to say that despite the 1,000-year difference, Yamamoto was making the exact same mistake that his younger self did 1,000 years ago. A mistake that Shuntui Kyoraku, who ends up succeeding Yamamoto, does not repeat. Who, unlike his master, threw aside his self-righteousness and was even willing to work with former enemies, all to achieve a common goal. I'll go much deeper into that in its own video. So getting back to Yamamoto, it's kinda clear that after he activates Kakajuma no Shidai Sojin, he kind of goes a little bit nuts. And there's multiple details in both the manga and the anime that really show Yamamoto's disconnection from reality. Like the absolutely nonsensical theory that Yamamoto came up with to explain why Yhwach couldn't steal his bankai. A belief that was very much predicated on Yamamoto selling himself as this absolute unit that even his enemies can comprehend, or something equally as nonsensical, when in actuality the truth couldn't be further from that fact. Or when Yamamoto drops one of the most ironic lines in the entire fight, where after he activates Kakajuma no Shidai Sojin, he tells Yhwach that it seems his mouth is working very fine, but his eyes aren't, when in actuality the only person who deserves such a comment is none other than himself, because he's the only person who's been blind this entire time. He's the only one who's had the truth right in front of him all this while, but just couldn't see it. The anime makes a really cool visual representation of just how far gone Yamamoto is. See, after he activates Kakajuma no Shidai Sojin, you notice that the entire environment changes. The outside world completely fades away, and we're left with a ghoulish, borderline hellish world, where only Yhwach and Yamamoto could be seen. And while this could have really just been Taguchi doing his thing, it still serves as a perfect example, or rather perfect representation, of Yamamoto's own state of mind, where he had forsaken literally everything except his revenge. And I think that's pretty clear when it comes to Yamamoto, but what about Yhwach? What happened when Yamamoto used Kakajuma no Shidai Sojin? I mean, were these the tears of a king who was regretful of the fact that he had led so many of his subjects to their deaths, or were these the tears of an actor who had just broken character? An actor who had signed up for a role far beyond his pay grade? Well, to find an answer to that question, we're first of all going to have to find an answer to this question. Does Yhwach actually care about his men? Well, the short answer is no. The long answer requires we take a very close look at how Yhwach treats the deaths of his men. My favorite example being how Yhwach reacts to the death of James. He expresses joy at the fact that James has died and gladly absorbs his soul and power, and even goes ahead to thank the souls of the dead, being both Shinigami and Quincy alike, for it was their deaths that allowed him to see that day. While at the same time, Yugrim explains to Uryu that the sternritter exists solely for Yhwach's sake, and both their lives and deaths benefit Yhwach. And sometimes when Yhwach feels that his men have been alive for too long, he kinda kills them himself. He believes that everything and everyone in the world exists solely to be used by him. They're tools, useful when needed, disposed of when unnecessary, and most of them know this. And even in his final battle with Ichigo, he pretty much says the exact same thing about Masaki, showing that he not only holds that sentiment for his own soldiers, but also generally for every single person. He tells Ichigo that there's literally no greater happiness than living and dying for him, and that since Masaki did exactly that, there's nothing more she could ever want. I mean, the guy calls to shoot Stoffel his children, and then in another panel, he just kills them all because, I quote, he doesn't need them anymore. So why would Yhwach be sad about these soldiers being reanimated to fight him? They fought and died for him. They served their purpose. Not to mention that despite being reanimated corpses, their souls still very much belong to Yhwach and are still within him as we speak. So if Yhwach wouldn't be bothered by this, then who would? A fellow soldier, seeing the corpses of his seniors being puppeteered by Yamamoto while having full knowledge of who they were and how they lived. And even though he had copied Yhwach's mind and memories and tried to exhibit the same nonchalance towards the lives of his soldiers as the original Yhwach, the fight would eventually push him to his breaking point where he couldn't keep up the act anymore. Also, speaking of the relationship between Yhwach and the sternritter, I think the anime foreshadows that in a really interesting way. See, right before Yamamoto finishes off Roid with Tenchi Kaijin, we get a shot from the first war of an unnamed dying Quincy reaching out towards Yhwach as he resolutely walks towards Yamamoto, which is immediately followed by the numerous skeletons summoned by Yamamoto making a similar motion, after which Yamamoto would kill Roid with Tenchi Kaijin. Originally, I thought this scene was simply just Yhwach being forced to remember the countless deaths his war against Soul Society had cost, and all the sacrifices that he had made to make it to this exact point. But the more I thought of it, the less sense it made to me. When you consider this single scene in the context of Yhwach as we know him throughout the story, it makes absolutely no sense, and I originally intended to ignore that scene as just weird anime shenanigans until I noticed something else. Right after this scene, as Roid lies on the ground dying, he also raises his hand, in a manner quite similar to the unnamed Quincy in the scene I was just talking about, in a manner not too dissimilar from the skeletons that immediately followed it. And his final words were neither a lamentation of the fact that his king had just forced him into a death match, nor were they an anger at the man who had just killed him. Instead, his final words were an apology. An apology to Yhwach for not being strong enough. And that's when it all came together. See, the thing about Yamamoto vs Yhwach is that it's one of those fights where everything makes sense after the fight is over. As in, a lot of the things you're going to be seeing will seem somewhat nonsensical until the fight ends and the big twist happens. And I think this is one of the many misdirections that the fight gives us. So here's what I think. That right before Yamamoto erased them all with Tenchi Kaijin, they too, just like Roid is about to, offered their apologies to Yhwach. I know this might sound like a reach, and it's very okay for you to feel that way, but one of the central ideas of this fight is that nothing is what it seems, and with the two scenes directly following each other, it kind of implies that whatever happened 1,000 years ago in the past is exactly what's happening right now. And with the added context from Roid's scene, it really does seem like that's exactly what they're going for. I think it's a genuinely brilliant setup for the Roid reveal, while also hinting at the truth behind Yhwach's relationship with the sternritter. And small spoiler alert, but you do actually see this happen again in the manga when Yugrim dies. He makes the exact same reaching motion that Royd makes, and also makes a very similar comment, except unlike Royd, who was apologizing for being weak, he was expressing his gratitude for being deemed strong enough by Yhwach to take his power. And while this moment is much more complex than my relating it to this scene might imply, it is still very relevant to the case. So concerning that matter, I will definitely leave you to be the judge of that, because now we've reached the end of the fight. So I think at this point in the video, it's pretty clear that Kubo definitely gave it his all when it comes to foreshadowing the major twist of this fight. But what about everything that comes afterwards? Talking specifically about the ending. And yeah, we're finally here, and I know a lot of people absolutely hated how the fight ended, mostly due to it not meeting their expectations of what a proper send-off for Yamamoto should have been. And while I guess that's a fair assessment, I absolutely loved this ending. But to understand why I absolutely loved this ending, we're going to have to go back in time, specifically 114 chapters ago, in Yamamoto vs. Aizen. This is a fight that many have noted to be quite similar to Yamamoto vs. Yhwach. But aside the shallow similarities between these two fights, there are some very clear parallels that appear to have been placed by intention. And it is in these purposefully placed parallels that Yamamoto's fate begins to unravel. The first and most interesting parallel is the fact that in both fights, Yamamoto's powers are restricted in some shape or form. But the power restriction achieves two completely contrasting effects. In the case of Yamamoto vs. Aizen, it only really serves as the bell being rung for the fight to begin. While in the case of Yamamoto vs. Yhwach, the power restriction ended up being the final nail in the coffin for Yamamoto. And the parallels don't stop there. In both fights, they play with the idea of senses being deceived. In Yamamoto vs. Aizen, Yamamoto's senses are influenced by external factors, that being Kyuka Suigetsu, which ends up having no effect on Yamamoto due to his using his spiritual senses and cunning. Whereas in Yamamoto vs. Yhwach, Yamamoto's senses are influenced by internal factors, precisely being his self-righteous anger, which was so strong in this situation that he completely let go of his cunning and his reason, the same things that helped him against Kyuka Suigetsu, and it completely blinds him to the most obvious of signs that the person he was fighting wasn't actually Yhwach. I could really just keep going, but overall I believe that the key parallel shared between these two fights is that Yamamoto faces an enemy specifically designed to fight him before fighting the main bad guy. But unlike Aizen, who would sacrifice Wonder Wise's mind, intellect, and reason to make him a much more effective counter to Yamamoto's power, Yhwach on the other hand would focus on creating an enemy who could attack Yamamoto's pride, which is specifically why he chose Royd, who could only perfectly imitate appearances, memory, and personality, instead of his brother Lloyd, who could perfectly imitate power and appearance. And Yhwach would even go ahead to restrict Royd from using the one thing that would have helped him fare much better against Yamamoto's power, that is the bankai stealing medallion. These perfectly positioned parallels reveal exactly what made the difference between Yhwach and Aizen's approach to fighting Yamamoto. Aizen seems to have assumed that the most threatening aspect of fighting Yamamoto was his power, forgetting the pride Yamamoto had in his role as Captain Commander. And as a result, merely removing his power did not affect that, which is what ends in Yamamoto beating Wonder Wise to death with his bare hands and Aizen's failure to kill Yamamoto. And Aizen's failure is further accentuated by the fact that Yamamoto was really the only Shinigami that he wanted to kill. But he not only fails to do so, but this also results in him leaving himself open to attack from Ichigo. But Yhwach, who had seen all of this unfold, had learned from Aizen's mistake, and he realized that to break Yamamoto, it wasn't his power he needed to destroy, it was his pride. And in the first invasion, Yhwach would begin working towards that very goal, starting off by killing Sasakibe, a person who was extremely close to Yamamoto, and then killing multitudes of the Shinigami that Yamamoto had begun to regard as his children, and then proceeding to have Sasakibe's bankai be used against Yamamoto, all to enrage him before his final encounter with who he thought was Yhwach. And at this point, Yamamoto didn't just want to kill Yhwach, he wanted to punish him. This was no longer about protecting Soul Society. To quote Jushiro, this was now a battle for one's pride, and Yhwach gave him exactly what he wanted. Yhwach gave Yamamoto a Yhwach he could torment, a Yhwach who could cry, a Yhwach who could delude Yamamoto into believing his power was beyond reason, not only feeding Yamamoto's darkest impulses, but also satisfying the self-righteous anger that fueled his fight, the idea that only his pain deserved avenging. so much so that he'd become more like the monster he claimed Yhwach was, acknowledging his power was going to destroy everything, but yet still taking time to gloat and torment his enemy, only to then finally kill him and then have that entire victory ripped from his hands. And after being disconnected from reality for so long, Yamamoto would now be forced to face it. And after the real Yhwach arrived, the weight of everything he had just done would begin to dawn on him. Not only did he threaten the lives of everyone he wanted to protect in Soul Society by using a power he did not need to use against a far inferior enemy, he did all of it for absolutely nothing. Then it was simple. All he had to do was rely on his power. Yes, the power he was so certain was beyond his enemy's comprehension, only to have that power also taken away from him. So not only did his foolishness allow a meeting between the two greatest enemies of Soul Society, he had just given his enemy the perfect weapon to destroy everyone he loved. And in his own eyes, he had failed on every level, not just as a teacher and a man, but most of all as a father. He had done exactly what he swore he'd never do again, to appear at a time Soul Society was in crisis and only make things worse. To put it simply, the monster had come back. And unlike in his previous battle with Aizen where his pride as Captain Commander wasn't touched, even after his power was taken away, Yhwach completely shatters Yamamoto's pride and then takes his power. And as Yhwach summons his blade, he knows he's won. Not because Yamamoto without his bankai was inconceivably beneath him in power, but because he knew he had completely broken the man. And as Yhwach raises his blade, Yamamoto lowers his. His pride would not let him raise it. The same pride that kept him fighting after losing his Zanpakuto against Aizen is the same pride that prevents him from raising it against Yhwach. He just couldn't forgive himself for how badly he had failed. He actually believed that he deserved to die. And Yhwach, knowing that this was exactly what he was going to choose, swung downwards knowing he wouldn't defend himself. And with the descent of that slash came the end of their 1,000-year conflict and the end of Yamamoto's life. In a lot of ways, this is an undeniably tragic ending to Yamamoto's character. But I believe that it's one thing to call it tragic and a completely different thing to say it was a bad one. I think the main twist of the fight was foreshadowed exceptionally well, and all the subtext does justify some of the seemingly weird parts. But still, to end on a more positive note, I like to think that Yamamoto was merely just the first chapter of a much more positive story, due to what comes immediately after his death. In a way, the same could be said for Yhwach, considering both Yamamoto and Yhwach's successors end up making decisions their masters would have never made to guarantee the futures of their people. Shunsui puts aside his self-righteousness and pride to do what needed to be done to save Soul Society and the world, even partnering with former enemies to achieve this goal, some of whom, like Aizen, ended up proving to be some of the greatest assets in the war. And Yugrum, when faced with the fact that his master would sacrifice the lives of all the Quincy for his own sake, made the choice to sacrifice his and Yhwach's lives to give the Quincy a future. So in a sense, Yamamoto's death wasn't just a great ending to his character, I also think that it was an absolute necessity to guarantee the victory of Soul Society. So with that said, thanks so much for watching, please like and subscribe, and while waiting for more videos, which will be coming very soon, you can watch my one good video. Yeah, that's it.